This week we are going to look at race and racism and how it pertains to anthropological study. We're going to look at the early notions of race, how did the concept first arise, as well as its social construction and perpetuation for the last few hundred years. So before we get into talking about kind of how we define race and its social construction, I want to bring up a more recent debate in science that occurred that really kind of strikes at the heart of kind of racist ideology that we see in kind of academic circles. It was the debate over Cheddar Man, which is England's quote-unquote first person. It's an anatomically modern human that dated to around 9100 BC. And the debate is over what his skin tone should have looked like. He had common genetic markers seen in modern human populations, particularly those in Northern Europe and England. But running the other parts of his genome, we know that he had likely had dark hair, blue eyes, and a darker skin tone. And we also know that he lacked the genetic foundation or the genes needed to produce lactase in order to process lactose, right? So he was lactose intolerant, which is what we find more commonly in African and Asian populations than we do in European populations. The Cheddar Man's remains were found in a place called Gough Cave, located at Cheddar Gorge, hence the name Cheddar Man. And when they ran his DNA sequencing, they know that he had genetic markers for skin pigmentation that we generally see associated with populations within sub-Saharan Africa. And he also had blue eyes. But it's important to also note that skin tone is what we call polygenic, right? So there are many different genes that affect the kind of pigmentation of skin, as well as skin is heavily influenced by environment. As we kind of reach the end of this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about why we have differences in skin tones amongst modern humans and why it is a response to significant environmental pressure. So Gough's Cave had a long occupation period, and it was occupied multiple times, likely by different groups of people, from about 11,000 to around 3000 BC. We even find some evidence of cannibalism on some of the bones that we find, or some of the human bones that we find there. The debate is over the oldest set of remains that have been found in the cave, close to that earliest part of the cave's occupation period. So the debate is really around kind of this notion that a lot of racists had, and assuming that the first British person was actually white, right? And the right here you see depicted the original kind of depiction of Cheddar Man, where they kind of defied what the science was saying and just kind of made the depiction based off of their kind of cultural assumptions on race. So the argument that they use is kind of based on that polygenic nature of skin tone, but nowadays we have genetic testing that is fine-tuned enough to be able to really determine kind of the genetic nature of skin tone. And this actually defies first-hand accounts by Roman soldiers, right? If we look at some of the first written records by Romans who first came to Britain, they would say that those accounts talk about people who were of a darker skin tone or a darker complexion. So not every person that lived in England was exclusively quote-unquote white. So as we move through this lecture, we will work on kind of these fundamental questions. How do we find or how do we define race? Is there a biological foundation for race? How is race constructed in various cultures, as well as what is a social construct and how does it relate to race? So to kind of define a social construct, it is ontologically subjective but epistemologically objective. It is ontologically subjective in that the construction and continued existence of social constructs are contingent on social groups and their collective agreement, imposition, and acceptance of such constructions, right? And what John Searle is really saying here is that these social constructs, they exist because we believe they exist. We make them up, but they have very tangible real world consequences, right? Whereas we're going to kind of find out throughout the semester that race is kind of not really, doesn't have much of a biological foundation. It is something that is very real in terms of culture and society, right? So race as a concept is real because we make it real. So if we were to define race, it's the cultural classification system by which physical characteristics are used to divide human populations into supposedly discrete groups, right? But remember, there are no real true genetic markers that indicate someone's skin tone, right? All we're really looking at are certain sections of the genome and comparing them to modern population, gene sequences to see if those they have a preponderance of genes that are close to someone of a certain skin tone, right? So we don't actually have true genetic markers that indicate, what a person's skin tone is. We can't narrow it down to one gene or the other. Why did the concept of race arise and continue to be perpetuated throughout kind of recent history? Racial categories were essentially created to justify classism. By placing someone in a discrete category like race, it is easier to attach stereotypes to those people or to deny them equal access to things like wealth, healthcare, and education, right? An example of a classist system, kind of a broad classist system, is the process of colonialism. So colonialism, kind of in a classic sense, really achieved its height shortly before World War I, in which most European powers had lucrative colonies across the globe. And in the colonial system, it asserted that those people living within colonial territories were incapable of governing themselves. Thus, that's why part of the justification that allowed those Europeans to kind of come in there and assert their domination over those indigenous peoples. So colonialism itself is the practice by which a nation extends its political and military influence outside of its own borders to gain access to wealth and raw materials, right? At its very base level, what they were looking for was wealth and raw materials. And then once they had established a foothold in those countries and established colonies, then came kind of the social justifications, the scientific justifications for having those systems continue to be in place, even though you can plainly recognize that there's a lot of inequality as well as racism, as well as classism going on in those colonial societies. So what really perpetuates race in a lot of societies today is this notion of biological versus environmental determinism, right? That if we're looking at biological determinism, that's saying all traits are innate and that they're controlled by genes, that every trait that a person has is biologically determined. But we also have environmental determinism, which says that all traits are influenced and shaped by environmental factors. And we're going to find out that in most cases, much like the acquisition of language, this kind of notion of determinism really is the idea of interactionism, right? There's what makes up the average person in terms of their biological and cultural makeup is a complex interaction between biology and the environment. So most of the very early racial classification systems that pop up from the 17th to 19th centuries, whether we're talking about Comte de Buffon or we're talking about Carolus Linnaeus, or we're even talking about some of Charles Darwin's comments on race, really this was all influenced by this notion of the great chain of being, right? And this great chain of being, as we kind of talked about in our discussion on evolution, is this idea that you can rank everything on Earth from most simple to most complex. So in essence, once they got done ranking all of the plants and animals out there, they started to move on to these kind of sub-rankings within specific species, more importantly, sub-rankings within humans, right? So the point of this was that those individuals or societies that were higher on the chain were therefore closer to God and therefore better than those societies or peoples who were not as high on the chain. So all these kind of early notions on race and racial classifications focused on primarily physical differences, but also on mental differences as well. Intelligence has always been a factor in rank-based human systems. So let's take a real quick look at kind of the development of kind of these thoughts on race. So let's take a quick look at some early notions on race, right? We kind of have to ask ourselves, did racism exist before we kind of had this scientific idea of defining race? Does racism necessarily have to relate to skin color, right? And what we're really talking about here is kind of between group prejudice, right? And before skin tone, people were discriminated against based on language or dress or cultural affiliation, or even and sometimes there was religious persecution as well. So during this period, we kind of see the classical period, which is really, we don't see racism in terms of people really defining each other based on skin color. What we really see is this kind of cultural racism where you're either defined as a member of the dominant culture or not a member. So it's not due to anatomical features, but rather your affiliation. If we look at an example, barbarian originated from a Greek word for basically meaning non-Greek, right? So in essence, people were defining themselves as members of, you know, their culture being the only right culture, and everyone else was kind of the other. And this is kind of one of the original driving forces behind the development of slavery systems as well. As we go into the Middle Ages, the period between 800 to 1500 AD, and this kind of covers the Dark Ages as well. We have the religious affiliation was used to discriminate and segregate people in multicultural societies, right? One group that was very heavily discriminated against during the Middle Ages, particularly in Europe, were people of the Jewish religion, right? And they were discriminated against in a variety of different ways, right? And this is where we first began to see kind of these determinist biological theories emerging during this period with kind of some of these religious writings that were talking about Jewish people and how they were innately evil or kind of more associated with Satan. And this was kind of really due to the antagonism between classic Judaism and this kind of newer Christianity. But this is kind of what Jewish people were facing. There was a lot of discrimination and kind of segregation based on religion. So in some of these Middle Age writings, we see some kind of interesting conclusions. In general, non-Christians were across Europe were viewed as kind of barbaric, unclean, and quote unquote savage. Many Christians sincerely believed that Jewish people ate children and worshiped Satan, and Jewish people were also viewed as biologically inferior during this period. And the reason I bring this up is because this is really where we start to see kind of the first build up to this notion of biological determinism, that you can directly link behavioral traits like intelligence and kind of just general all cultural patterns directly to biology. So as you move through kind of the Enlightenment period in Europe, you start to see a shift in kind of this defining and kind of these pejorative or segregative behaviors within different cultures is starting to shift away from being culturally based and religiously based to more anatomically based, right? This is kind of coming out of the age of early science, where they were now trying to define races based on anatomical traits like skin color, skull size, long bone length, blood group, etc. There were a whole host of different types of kind of categories that they were trying to create these kind of discrete groupings of humans. So if we look at some of the kind of earlier writings that were coming out about race during this time, we have one from kind of our own history here in the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who actually wrote that he had a suspicion that blacks are inferior to whites in both mind and body. And the racial classification system kind of, at the time, allows for people like Jefferson to view blacks as quote-unquote separate creatures, and explains how one so apt to proclaim liberty and equality for all can still justify owning slaves, right? So really, at this point, as you start to get into these kind of slave systems and things like that, you start to find these justifications that were being created to kind of separate people of color away from essentially the slavers, so that it kind of acts as a way for, well, we don't have to feel guilty about this because these people are quote unquote not exactly human. They're not exactly us, so they're not deserving of the same kind of respect that we give ourselves. That was kind of the prevailing thought that we see really kind of in the 18th century all the way through up until essentially the early 20th century. If we look at one contemporary during the 18th century, we have Carolus Linnaeus. He's most famous for developing the binomial nomenclature system of scientific classification for animals and plants. You know, we all are familiar with it, the species names, genus, family, order, class, phylum, et cetera, et cetera. But he also tried to classify humans as well, and he came up with a little schema or a little chart for classifying the various human groups on the planet, right? He had Americanus, which were people of red skin. He had the Europaeus, which were people of white skin. He had the Asiaticus, which were people of sallow skin, which is kind of pale and yellow. They had the Afar, which was people of black skin. They had the Ferris people, which were wild people. These would be essentially your hunter-gatherers or your tribal level people. He had troglodytes, which were ignorant people who live in caves. I'm not exactly sure what he was referring to here. And he also had monstrous, which were giants and mutants, because I think he must have wanted to leave a little bit of wiggle room there in case we found some human groups that we haven't come across before. We also have another contemporary of Linnaeus, a guy named Comte de Buffon, who popularized the term race over the Linnaean term subspecies. As a matter of fact, Linnaeus may have came up with one of our first kind of racial classification systems, but he didn't call them races. He called them subspecies of humans. So he acknowledged that, you know, all of them were in fact human, but he, you know, wanted to kind of create, you know, fit them within his binomial nomenclature system. But Comte de Buffon actually popularized the term race, right? And he believed that there was a geographic and climatic origin for race. For example, in his writings, he says that Africans have dark skin because the high prevalence of sunshine in Africa had burned the skin over time. He also believed in something called the fixity of species, that a species is created once and does not change. So he believed that people of different color, that, you know, white people versus black people versus Asian people, were all kind of separate races and thus kind of separate species as well. So as we move kind of into the post-Darwinian era in terms of scientific and social scientific investigation of humans, we kind of see a divergence of this folk and scientific notion of race, right? Anthropologists and other scientists to this point have observed that there's a clinal variation of measurable traits, right? And really what this is saying is that there is a slow variation within our species of traits like skin color. And we're going to talk about later on in this presentation why we have differences in skin color amongst humans. They also noticed a non-concordance of the variation of traits, right? This is just meaning that there's a huge wide variation in every single trait across different human groups, and we find those traits in all human groups. And we also discovered, talking about DNA, we looked at mitochondrial DNA and figured out that everyone came from Africa. Essentially, what mitochondrial DNA does is it traces back, you know, through your mother's or the matrilineal line of your blood and can determine where you originally came from, right? And all human DNA traces back to Africa, right? So if we kind of take a quote from a famous bioanthropologist named Jonathan Marks, he says the more traits that you look at, the more races you could see. And what he's really kind of noting is that there's such a huge wide variation in our species with all of these different traits that you could create all sorts of different classification systems depending on what traits you're looking at. So physical measurements themselves do not identify distinct categories of humans to correspond with this kind of folk notion of race. So let's continue talking about some of these early social scientists that have written on human race. As we know today that race has no biological foundation, that is based off of a lot of observational research as well as DNA research. But during much of the 19th century, all the way up until the 20th century, we really didn't have a whole lot of information to go off of. And there was really a lot of pressure. Whether it was conscious or unconscious, there was a lot of cultural pressure for social scientists to come up with justifications to kind of legitimize the inequality that was going on in these various societies. One of these individuals that you may have learned about in your biology classes, named George S. Cuvier, he came up with the notion of catastrophism in evolutionary theory. But he actually also looked a lot at the concept of race, and he dissected a African woman named Sarah Bartman when she died in 1817, and she was a native woman from Cape Town in South Africa. And Cuvier claimed, rather fraudulently, that she was more similar to an orangutan than she was a human, right, in terms of her anatomy. So Sarah, unfortunately, had a kind of tragic history in terms of her life. She spent her life on display in a traveling zoo in Europe. So based on Cuvier's kind of odd studies on the minor differences in skeletal anatomy, he created this racial classification system that which essentially mirrored social inequality that he saw in Europe at the time. He had, of course, Caucasians, which were Europeans, Mongolians, which were Asians, and Ethiopians, which were Africans. So you might be asking, if Cuvier did an autopsy essentially of this woman, how would he come to the conclusion that her anatomy was more close to that of an orangutan than a human, right? We know that, based on the photo of her that you can see here, she was clearly a human being, right? Scientists essentially at the time wanted to find a different way in which Africans evolved into humans. And this essentially would say that a different evolutionary path would justify essentially the existing social order, right? We don't have to treat people of color equally because they are quote unquote not exactly human, right? And this was during a time when most scholars refuted a common ape ancestor or a common ape ancestor evolutionary lineage for humans. So if we hop across the Atlantic and look at an American scientist who was doing work shortly after Cuvier, we have the American geologist and physician from Pennsylvania named Samuel Morton, and he supported this notion of polygenism, or this multiple creation event for various species. He refuted the biblical notion of Noah's Ark based on his examination of Egyptian mummies. In essence, he essentially proved that there was no great flood. He claimed that people of African descent were inferior based on measurements of their brain size that he inferred from measuring their skulls. The problem with Morton is that essentially what we see at this time is this kind of practice of phrenology, which is measuring different elements of the skull and trying to make assertions about an individual's intelligence based on those measurements of the skull. So what he was really doing is taking a very pitifully small sample size of a group of Egyptian mummies, measuring the skulls, and then making an inference to all Africans and their intelligence. So kind of using Morton as an example of what the prevailing trend in kind of academic science was at the time. For much of this 19th century period, European as well as American scientists were trying to enforce this dogma, which asserted you can rank humans based on race, and that intelligence directly corresponds to race, which of course all of them their studies tended to confirm what they had already wanted to see, which was white people being on top and Africans and Asians and Mexicans being on the bottom. American physician, using Morton as an example, he collected skulls from various cultures all over the world. He filled the skulls with chickpeas and other materials and asserted that Africans and African Americans were less intelligent based on how many chickpeas could fit within those skulls, right? So, long story short, Morton spent an entire lifetime trying to justify the status quo by asserting a biological foundation for the social inequality of the day using fraudulent data and unscrupulous statistical testing, right? There are actually scientists who have gone and taken Morton's number and reran them and corrected for the bias and actually found that his conclusions were dramatically incorrect. So, pulling another example from American Science at the time, you have Josiah Knott, who published the book called Types of Mankind. He used physical characteristics in the skull, such as cranial capacity, to attempt to prove that people of African descent had smaller brains and thus less intelligence, right? So, in essence, what we were seeing is kind of this ramp up right before the American Civil War of using science as a way to prove or as a way to kind of justify keeping people of color at kind of a lower end of the social order. So, and it's interesting because Josiah Knott, who was a medical doctor, actually started his career out doing some pretty good science. He debunked the miasma hypothesis for yellow fever, kind of proving that there was no such thing as bad air that made you sick, or that caused things like yellow fever. But he kind of switched focus to these kind of race-based writings. And unfortunately, just to kind of show you this kind of focus on race and the inequality of white people versus black people in America really affected everybody within the culture, right? Even people that we kind of today consider as being people who kind of fought for civil rights in a sense. At the time still kind of believed that white people and black people were not equal. Abe Lincoln himself, right, he felt that blacks should not hold land or be able to vote. And he was elected on an abolitionist platform, but that was mostly due to kind of some political advantages as well that came along with that platform. And from his own writings, he says that the physical difference between the white and black races, which will ever forbid those two races living together on in terms of social and political equality, right? And what he was really doing is, I'm not saying that Abe Lincoln was a racist. I'm saying that Abe Lincoln believed that there was already this kind of platform of inequality that existed, and he believed that that was due to some sort of innate physical difference, right? So it's essentially kind of believing in that notion that there's this biological determinism, that, the reason societies are the way they are is because we are born and built that way to kind of conduct society in that manner. And remember, during this time, or shortly after kind of the post-Civil War period, we do have a kind of shift in social science, particularly in anthropology, away from this idea that we can measure intelligence and associate that directly to race, right? We have Franz Boas, and remember, we've talked about him before in our earlier lectures. And remember, he did that study on LSI and basically debunking the notion that biological determinism exists, right? He found that really skull sizes and body proportions are more kind of related to the environment and diet rather than some sort of innate genetic trait, right? Remember, he also championed the ethnographic method during his field work amongst the Cuyahoga people of the Northwest United States, right? And he developed that notion of cultural relativism as well as historical particularism. So during much of that 19th century period, we see just this kind of huge investment in this notion of scientific racism. And really what they're trying to do is prove that, Africans are not necessarily, and people of color are not necessarily not human, but they're not as evolved as, let's say, your Caucasian people or even Asian people, right? They had an entire kind of ranking system in which, placed people on an evolutionary scale, which we know today is absolutely, ridiculous. There's no actual scientific foundation for that. But if you're able to do something like that and prove that, let's say, people of color are not as evolved as white people, it justifies that social inequality that exists, right? It provides a scientific means by which to say, oh, okay, we don't need to change society because, well, this is just how it is because, science has proven that these people are quote unquote inferior. So kind of the culmination of this kind of science racism movement really kind of got going in the early 20th century, beginning kind of in the late 19th century, with eugenics, right? And this is the science of improving a human population by controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable and heritable traits amongst human populations, right? And this is really based on kind of a gross oversimplification of Darwinian theory, right? Because we know today, based on genetic studies, that you do not want to limit the variation that you have in your gene pool. And by selective breeding, you are essentially limiting the variation and narrowing down your gene pool, right? And having variation with your gene pool makes you more adaptable to the environment, and it also makes you more able to respond to genetic disease. So this is more kind of based on explaining and justifying social inequality and barbarism rather than really actually improving anything. In the 1930s, kind of in the heart of the eugenics movement here, we had Carlton Kuhn, who created over 30 racial categories, and he based these racial categories on cranial and long bone measurements, right? And he defined a race as a somatically unique population or collection of populations. So essentially, if he was able to prove that you all had around similar skeletal measurements, then you should all be part of the same race. So what Kuhn was looking for was anatomical similarities, right? And this was based off of a pitifully small sample size, about 200 skeletons, and he created over 30 categories with 200 skeletons, so that means that only a few people at best would be in each category. So in essence, it was just bad science and bad statistical testing from the very start. So during this eugenics movement, which lasted roughly kind of through shortly after the end of World War II, the word essentially was coined originally by Francis Galton, who was actually a cousin of Charles Darwin in the 1860s. And there were over 30 plus countries around the world that had their own kind of versions of eugenics. And these were organizations of social reformers, biologists, doctors, and other professional experts. So this wasn't like these weren't like government programs that were set up to kind of control the population. These were actually experts and professionals that were kind of guiding these programs and setting these programs up. It was seen as both being politically and scientifically progressive to apply this new science of human genetics to control and engineer population health and fitness amongst humans. And there was also this economic rationale that if you improve the human population, you would reduce the burden of welfare services and increase the efficiency of your population overall. So Galton defined eugenics as the study of the agencies under social control, essentially things that we are able to control, that improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally, right? So the whole point behind eugenics was to essentially set up a program where we get everybody in the system where we can measure their traits, see what traits they have, and prevent certain people who have traits that we believe are bad from reproducing, thus not passing those traits on to the next generation, right? And if you think about this, if this was implemented and went in the long run, all this would do would be essentially to weed down our gene pool, as well as you have to understand the ethical conflict in who gets to decide what a bad trait is, right? Just because a father commits murder, does that mean his son will necessarily commit murder, right? Just because a person may be, have a genetic disease, does that mean that their son or daughter is going to have the genetic disease? That may not necessarily be true. It may skip a generation. So we can't really kind of use this notion of eugenics to really improve our species as a whole. So Galton distinguished between two types of kind of eugenics. He said there was positive versus negative eugenics, right? He said positive eugenics was encouraging people with quote-unquote good genes to have more children, and negative eugenics or negative selection, which is not allowing bad genes to be reproduced. And this can be done using forced sterilization or abortions, marriage restrictions, as well as euthanasia. The ethical problem that we have with this type of line of thinking within any culture is that you run into the question of who gets to decide what's considered a bad trait, right, or what's considered good genes versus bad genes. The eugenics movement and kind of the corresponding legislation that was passed in many different states was in fact targeted. It tended to disproportionately affect people who were poor as well as people of color. California has the highest number of forced sterilizations that have ever been done, at least nationwide. And generally, it was done on people in mental health facilities. For men, it was done to curb aggressiveness, and for women, it was done to curb reproduction. Native American women were targeted until the 1980s in reservation hospitals, and between 1970 and 1980, the number of forced sterilizations in the United States rose from 200,000 historically to 700,000. This is kind of something that we don't really kind of talk about in our history books. That yes, in fact, in a lot of our state and federal mental health facilities, it was actually perfectly legal for them to sterilize those individuals based off these kind of antiquated eugenics-based sterilization laws. So in this lecture, we will, we've kind of covered the development of the concept of race and, kind of how race and racism and presents in the United States. But be sure to review in your textbook how racial categories are formulated in other areas like the Dominican Republic or Brazil or Malaysia. And you can click the link here to see how race is categorized cross-culturally today, right? So you'll kind of see how a bunch of different countries categorize race based on quote-unquote skin color. Now that we've reviewed racial categories for a little bit, let's kind of take a closer look at how race and racism presents itself, particularly within our own culture, within the United States, as well as some of the other first world cultures around the world. What I'll start with is this kind of notion of miscegenation, which was a demeaning term for interracial marriages. Until 1967, many states in the U.S. had anti-miscegenation laws preventing people of different colors from marrying. Essentially, white people and black people were not allowed to intermarry in a lot of the southern states, as well as parts of the West. And even if we look at in other areas of the world, the apartheid in South Africa, in one of those colonial areas, lasted until the final piece of legislation was repealed in 1985. And that essentially meant that, there was complete and utter segregation in all parts of black and white society in South Africa. One thing that we see as a result of kind of this concept of race and creating racial categories is, one racial group ends up getting kind of more benefits out of society than others, whichever essentially group is in power. And this kind of creates this nice notion of whiteness and white privilege, right? Whiteness is a cultural construct dating back to 1691 that outlines who is white and who is not. It was originally crafted and created to afford privileges to poor landless whites in Virginia, such as gown ownership or a little bit of civil rights in terms of like being able to vote and things like that. And that was essentially because they didn't, some of the wealthy plantation owners and things like that were kind of a little nervous that the landless poor whites would team up with the enslaved Africans and kind of revolt against them. So in essence, creating these kind of racial categories and the concept of whiteness was done to prevent poor whites from banding together with African slaves and natives against the European economic elites. If you click on the link below, you'll watch a video that talks a little bit about white privilege and what it means to kind of have these automatically ascribed privileges that you are born with that you may not realize that you have just because of the color of your skin. So make sure you follow the link and watch that video. It's important, and we'll kind of move on and kind of circle back to this in later lectures. So when you have racial categories, now we can kind of talk about and define racism a little bit and the different types of racism. Racism itself is a complex system of power that draws upon culturally constructed racial categories to rank people as either being inferior or superior to one another. And remember, racial categories, throughout history have always been created by the majority of people and those in power, right? And they are used to maintain power and have no real basis in biology or science, right? There's really no reason why we need to classify humans on these different traits like skin color or intelligence or anything like that. There are two types of racism, the individual versus institutional, right? So individual racism is based on a person's taught beliefs on race, right? This is kind of the racism you are taught by your parents. It manifests in the form of disrespect or outward aggression or suspicion of people of a different race or quote unquote race. You also have institutional racism, which are patterns by which racial inequality is perpetuated through policies, institutions, and systems. A good example of these are, in history, are the Jim Crow laws of the South that prevented black individuals from being able to, go to the same schools, being able to kind of own the same property or even have the same property rights as white individuals. So institutional racism, we see it really today through kind of our policing system as well as inequalities in access to health care as well as access to quality food systems. One of the kind of more recent things that we see in terms of manifestation of racism in the United States is this kind of racial ideology of color blindness. And this is actually one of the kind of counter arguments that some people use against kind of voicing their opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that. And it's this notion that, since we have basically proven there's no real biological foundation for race, then we should all just be, quote, colorblind. It's, skin color doesn't matter, so, we shouldn't take it into consideration at all, and we shouldn't really be, going up in arms over skin color. The problem with this kind of colorblind stance is that it ignores centuries of legal racism and institutional inequality, which has established an uneven playing field in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, and in terms of economic opportunities. At this point, we've talked about racial categories. We've talked about kind of the history of the concept of race. So let's kind of pull away from those kind of aspects and look at, well, why did racism and race kind of start in the first place, or why did we even have this categorization based on skin color, and why do we even have differences in skin color, right? So let's take a slight look real quick at variation in living people. So remember, there is no requirement that we divide our species, Homo sapiens, into subspecies or quote-unquote races, right? There are no pure races anywhere, and there are very, very few genetic markers that are common to anyone of a particular race. So to kind of go inside with this opposition to race, humans themselves, we are not very genetically variable as a species, right? There's actually more variation in emperor penguins than there is in between any two human beings, right? And emperor penguins basically look identical to one another, right? We share 99.9% of our DNA with one another. It's only 1/10 of 1% is different between every given human being. The most genetically diverse place on the planet is Africa, which, makes a lot of sense because if we all came back to, trace our ancestry back to Africa at around 100 to 200,000 years ago, that would mean that Africa is the kind of area in which humans have existed the longest. It's the area in which we have bred the longest. So it is the area that it makes sense that we would find the most genetic diversity between human populations. And what we're really talking about here when we talk about, classifying humans into different races, we're talking about skin color, right? And some traits in our bodies are very simple. They're ruled by just one gene pair, but some traits and most traits in our bodies are very complex. They're what we call polygenetic or polygenic, and they're ruled by several pairs of genes. Things like your blood type is very simple, right? That's kind of ruled by just a pair of genes. But things like skin color are very complex, right? There are multiple genes that are involved in determining the shade of someone's skin. And we do know that polygenetic traits like skin color, hair color, adult height, overall body proportions are also strongly affected by diet and the environment as well. Think about hair color, right? There are some people whose hair turns darker during the wintertime and whose gets a lot lighter during the summertime, right? That's an example of the polygenetic trait that is affected by the environment, right? Skin color as well, right? We're going to see here in a minute that skin color in and of itself is really just a response to ancestral levels of ultraviolet radiation exposure that we received from the sun where our ancestors grew up. And what we're really talking about here is melanin, right? Melanin is what is responsible for the pigmentation of your skin. And in the kind of outer layer of your skin, in the epidermal layer, you have these cells called melanocytes, right? And what they are responsible for is taking vitamin D and producing melanin. Essentially, there are two types of melanin, and every single human on the planet has melanin in their skin. There's a brown-black melanin as well as a brown-red melanin. And it's not only the melanin or level of melanin that really determines skin type, right? You also have kind of the way your skin cells reflect light, how transparent your skin cells are, as well as kind of the variation in coloring of your veins and arteries, which can also affect your skin tone as well. To give you a brief summary of why melanin is so important inside of your body, it essentially acts as a shield. And what it does is it prevents ultraviolet radiation from the sun getting through your skin, layers of your skin, and destroying the vital nutrient within your body called folate. If you lose your folates, then you lose the ability to really reproduce cells efficiently, and there's all sorts of deleterious health consequences that go along with that. So in essence, what we see here is that areas of the planet where the ultraviolet radiation coming from the sun is the most intense, i.e. areas near the equator, we see that areas around there have the darker skin tones, right? Because that melanin acts as a shield against that ultraviolet radiation, only letting just enough of it through your skin to produce vitamin D. So in essence, the reason why we have variation in skin color is because at some point your ancestors grew up in an area with a certain degree of ultraviolet radiation, and your ancestors' biology and skin is strongly affected by that ultraviolet radiation and responds by becoming either lighter or darker, right? In areas where people have lighter skin, there's less ultraviolet radiation, which means that they have to have less melanin in order to get more sunlight coming in to produce vitamin D.